Welcome to This Explainer. I'm super excited you're here today because we're tackling a genuinely fascinating mystery that goes right to the heart of youth sports, talent development, and really how we evaluate our young athletes. If you're a wrestling parent, a youth coach, or an athlete yourself, you're definitely going to want to hear this. Have you ever wondered if a wrestler's birth month might actually impact their trajectory in the sport? I know, it kind of sounds like astrology, right? But there's actual, hard sports science behind this. So let's dive right in and see what the data actually tells us about age, growth, and wrestling success. So think about this. Are January-born athletes actually more talented than November-born athletes? I mean, we see this scenario all the time at tournaments. You've got two 10-year-olds stepping onto the mat. One looks like they're already getting recruited for college, and the other looks, well, like a regular 10-year-old. A lot of times, parents and coaches see that bigger, stronger kid dominating and just immediately assume, wow, natural prodigy right there. But what if they aren't actually more gifted? What if they're just 10 or 11 months older than their opponent in that exact same age bracket? When you're a kid, almost a full year of extra physical growth, that is a massive advantage. So we really have to ask, are we confusing physical maturity with actual raw talent? Well, that brings us to a huge concept in sports science called the relative age effect, or RAE. Basically, RAE is a phenomenon where athletes born earlier in the selection year are mistakenly perceived as more talented. Because they've literally just had more time on Earth to grow, they're often taller, faster, and stronger than the kids born later in the year. Now, the trick here is that this physical maturity advantage can cause genuinely promising late-born athletes to get completely overlooked early in their careers by talent scouts and national team selectors. It's not that they lack talent, they just haven't caught up biologically yet. Let's look at the U17 European Wrestling Championships study to see how this actually plays out. To figure out how much this effect happens on the wrestling mat, researchers Tuba Maliokalu and Burhan Demirkiran looked at a really robust sample size. 558. That is the number of elite youth athletes they analyzed at the U17 European Wrestling Championships. When you have data on 558 athletes competing at the international level, you can start to see some very clear, undeniable trends in how talent is being selected. And frankly, this highly competitive developmental age group where physical growth is just exploding is the absolute perfect testing ground for the relative age effect. And the researchers didn't just lump everyone into one big group either. They carefully broke down their analysis into the three distinct Olympic wrestling categories: men's freestyle, men's Greco-Roman, and women's wrestling. This is super important because the dynamics of physical growth and the styles of competition vary a ton between these categories. Doing it this way gives us a really beautifully complete picture of what's actually going on. Okay, really quick safety check before we get to the juicy findings. We need to remember this was an observational study. What that means is we're looking at a snapshot of one specific competition. It shows us a correlation at a specific time and place, but it doesn't prove universal causation. It absolutely does not mean your birth month is your ultimate destiny as a wrestler. It's just a really interesting lens to view the selection process through, not a crystal ball. All right, moving into finding the bias in the men's and women's results. So when looking at the national team selections for the young men, the answer was a resounding yes. The relative age effect was highly evident. Athletes born in the first quarter of the year, so January through March, were significantly overrepresented on these national teams. On the flip side, the guys born in the fourth quarter, October through December, were starkly underrepresented. The researchers noted this bias was especially strong in men's freestyle, and it was still there, though slightly more moderate in men's Greco-Roman. Essentially, early-born male athletes were definitely being favored for selection, likely because of that early physical maturity we talked about. But get a load of this next finding. In women's wrestling, there was absolutely no relative age effect detected. Literally none. The birth month distribution across the female athletes was just roughly even across the board. There was no meaningful bias toward early-born girls and no bias against late-born girls. It was just a completely different landscape compared to the men's brackets at that exact same tournament. Now, you're probably wondering, why the massive difference? Well, the researchers proposed a few really interesting hypotheses for this women's data. And keep in mind, these are hypotheses, not established biological facts. First, they thought differences in overall participation rates between boys and girls might impact how deep that selection pool actually is. Second, the distinct timing of puberty. Girls often hit their growth spurts earlier than boys, which means by the U17 level, physical disparities might have already totally leveled out. And third, maybe coaches evaluate women's wrestling differently, placing a heavier weighting on technical and tactical qualities rather than just raw early physical strength. Let's shift gears and look at the impact of weight classes. Now, you might be thinking, hey, wait a minute, wrestling has weight classes. Doesn't that perfectly solve the problem of bigger kids dominating? And yes, they do help immensely. Weight classes absolutely moderate the relative age effect. But in the junior male categories at least, they do not completely eliminate it. Even when matched exactly by weight, an older U17 boy might still have a maturity advantage, like muscle density, leverage, or just general nervous system development. So the fact that we still see bias in selection proves physical maturity plays some role during those rapid growth years, even with the scale leveling the playing field. Okay, get ready for the big reveal. Selection versus success. If you've been listening to this and worrying that a late-in-the-year birthday ruins a wrestler's chances, I have an amazing plot twist for you. The researchers looked at who was selected to compete versus who actually won a medal. We already know the selection process was heavily influenced by birth month for the boys. But when they analyzed just the athletes who actually reached the podium, the relative age effect completely vanished. Let me see that one more time. Birth month had zero effect on who actually won medals. Being born in January might help you get picked for the team when you're 16 because you look the part, but it gives you absolutely no advantage when it comes to actually winning the matches that matter. How cool is that? Let's wrap this up with some context and conclusions. To understand how to apply this globally, we really have to look at cutoff dates. This specific study was based on the United World Wrestling Standard, which uses a January 1st cutoff date. That's exactly why the January kids had the advantage here. But this might not transfer directly to your local system at home. A lot of countries use a September school year cutoff, and in Japan, their academic and sporting calendar usually kicks off in April. So if you're wrestling in a Japanese school system, that early born advantage might actually apply to April or May babies, not January ones. The effect just shifts depending on the system's rules, which proves, once again, that this is an administrative bias, not biological destiny. Which leads us perfectly into the ultimate takeaway of the sport. What ultimately determines success is technical skill, tactical intelligence, decision-making, mental toughness, and consistent training over time. Honestly, pure wrestling ability and sheer resilience matter so much more than what month you happen to be born in. Sure, the system might have a slight blind spot when you're young, but the mat never lies. The mat doesn't care about your birthday. It cares about your technique, your grit, and your heart. So I'll leave you with this. If birth month only helps with getting selected but has zero impact on who actually brings home the hardware, are you ready to stop worrying about age brackets and start focusing on the skills that actually win medals? To all the late-born athletes out there, keep grinding, keep developing your technique, and keep building that mental toughness. Your time on the podium isn't determined by the calendar. It's determined by you. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep training hard, and I'll catch you next time.